All right. So after making that bush that we made, I decided before I started making more plants to demonstrate how to use Paint Effects to make custom plants that I needed a scene to work on just because just making plants by themselves is a little boring. So I just needed some kind of context which would help me figure out what kind of plants we could make. And so what I did is I spent a couple days after recording that last chapter on bushes and made this scene. And it's relatively simple, um, but as far as I mean, simple is relative, but it's something that incorporates a bunch of Paint Effects trees, incorporates the Ivy Gen tool that we can see going up these trees. All the plants we see in here are generated with Paint Effects. The bushes that we see inside here uh, right there are the bushes that we made. And so I simply made, if we look inside here, uh, those four in the scene that we created and exported them and imported this into the scene and then made a couple more copies. So these are manually placed. All the geometry that we see in here is manually placed objects. The trees are from Onyx, which I'll be getting to in another DVD. So but for the scene, what I also have in here is all of the geometry that's for the terrain and the path is actually emitting particles. And so the details of using particles and the instancer and techniques for that I get into much more in later DVDs. I do quite a bit of that on the grass DVD. But let's take a look at first what happens in this scene if I hit play on the timeline. And what we're going to see is a whole bunch of extra geometry is going to pop in. And so my polygon count, which was at 4 million for this scene, we can see up here has now jumped to 92 million. So I have 92 million polygons, only 4 million of raw geometry, and the rest of it is created via particle instancing. And so let me jump to Photoshop, and this is what the scene looks like. And so the really fun thing with this is that with all of the techniques I've been doing a lot of R&D over for the last couple months is I can now build these kinds of scenes really fast. So this scene was about a day and a half from scratch, including generating all of the plants and making the geometry for the terrain and so forth. Because with the techniques I've developed, and as I develop and grow my library of plants and trees and textures for all of these things, it gets faster and faster to kind of build these kind of scenes. So this is a 4K render that I did, so it's relatively big. And so what we can see is all of these plants that are inside here are Paint Effects created from starting with a preset and then customizing it. So none of the plants we see in here are Paint Effects presets. And none of the textures come from the Paint Effects library. These are all, hand-generated textures from scanning leaves and stuff like that. And so if we look around, we can see there's a lot of stuff in here. And so I can actually zoom in at 100%. I haven't done any real post work on this yet. So this is mostly a raw render from Maya and Mental Ray, just with a little bit of levels, color correction in Photoshop. So if I really wanted to finish this up, I would render a Z-depth pass and add a little bit of depth of field and atmosphere, because clearly everything's in focus right now is a little artificial. But for the purposes of looking around and seeing how much stuff is in here, and the fact that rendering 91 million polygons is really not a big deal at all. So for the scenes that I've developed for these DVDs, they range really anywhere from maybe 10 million polys up to maybe a couple 100 million polys. But I've really been able to render as high as 10 billion polygons. That's the highest I've ever tried. That's done via mental ray proxies as opposed to the instancer. But again, this is all stuff I get into in later DVDs. So for now, our focus is the plants and how all of the plants that we see inside here were generated. So we've already talked about a bush. Again, the bushes that we see in here are the bush we made. And so I just want to talk about some of these little spider plants and ferns, these longer plants in here that have longer leaves, these more broadleaf plants, the little ground cover leaves that I have, and how this was all done. So let's go back to Maya, take a look at the scene a little bit further, um, and then we'll take a look at these individual plant files and how to create them. So if I jump back to Maya inside here and I rewind to frame 1, so I just get all of the particle instancer created geometry. For this scene, as far as the plants that were made with paint effects, if I look inside here, we can see some eucalyptus trees. So these again are made with onyx, which is on a later DVD. We have our bushes, which we created together already. I can see that I have some ferns, and so we're going to talk about how to make ferns and 2 different techniques for that. I've got what I'm calling spider plants, so I'm not a botanist, so I don't know the actual name for these types of plants, but I created 2 different kinds. One that has, as we can see inside here, thinner leaves, and then one that has thicker leaves. And so just obviously generated from the same preset, just a few different detailed differences. Different shader, and then obviously these thins are a little bit more curved and thin. These are a little bit more straight. And so let's go and zoom in a little bit, just so we can take a look at these plants. So again, we can see those versus these. And so I do choose to manually place some plants as opposed to having everything be done via particle instancing, just because I can be a little bit more precise. Obviously, when you use particle instancing, they're randomly generated, emitting off of my terrain geometry based on textures that I've painted of where they should emit from, but it's random every time you hit play. So for things that are in the midground and background, that's actually totally fine, but for things that are in the foreground, I want a little bit more consistency and control over that. So we have these plants. We can see what I'm calling clovers. I'm not really using a clover texture, but this is another Paint Effects custom brush that I made. And so just wanting to get something that's low with ground cover where the leaves are facing the sky. And this was manually painted onto the geometry. So as opposed to these where I, one by one place them into position. With these clovers, I actually, you can see, imported the paint effect stroke that I created so that I could actually select my terrain geometry. And I didn't use this. This is a decimated version from ZBrush. I have a lower res version of it. And then I could select that, make it via paint effects, make it paintable. And then I actually went in for these clovers and just drew strokes. So I could be very, very precise of where these appear in the scene. I can see I've got some rocks that I placed in the scene. So those are actually, as we can see, not really showing up as geometry because there's those 2. There they are. Just a couple rocks, no big deal. Just a sphere that's sculpted in ZBrush. But these are instanced because down in this little valley down there, there's a whole bunch of them. So we can see if I go to Photoshop for a sec, there's just a bunch of rocks on the ground down there. And a couple you can see are popping up closer via the instancer. So let's go back to Maya. And then let's see what else. Tree clover. It's the same ground cover that I painted in here, but I painted some of it on these tree branches by making those paintable. Just so I could have something, close to camera, because if I look at the render camera, I just added some cool detail there. These leafy fronds, I created 2 different kinds of those in Paint Effects. So meaning just a long stem with a broader leaf at the end of it. And so for these I created 2 different kinds. So this one, which we can see is a little bit shorter as far as the stem length, and then this, which has much longer stems. So, and then finally there's the ivy that's on the trees, which was all generated via the Ivy Gen tool, which we've already talked about, which is really cool. So that's what's going on in here that we need to sort of explore further. How did I make all these plants? And so they're all fairly basic, just a few things you want to understand. And then ferns can be a little tricky, so we'll look at that as well. So let's, I guess, take a look at the scene files for some of these plants I made, and then I'll show you how to create them, or those types of plants from scratch. So let's do that.